Welcome back to another episode of the Future in Health podcast. Today, I have a very dear friend and a colleague, Dr. Randa Perkins, who is the CMIO at Moffitt Cancer Center. One of the things I love telling her, and is very true, is she's probably one of the best CMIOs I've worked with. And you'll find out why in the next 25 minutes. But without further ado, welcome, Randa. Thank you for participating and agreeing to be part of this podcast. I have often been very impressed with your take on how to operationalize very complex concepts of innovation into healthcare systems. And I think that that perspective is especially important today for us as an industry as we're thinking about AI and Gen AI solutions. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. But before we do that, would you like to give us an intro to the audience about you and your background?
Sure. Thank you very much. And no pressure, right, with an intro like that. Thank you very much, Kamal. You're very kind. So I am the Chief Medical Information Officer at Moffitt Cancer Center. I am a family medicine doc by training and also still seeing patients. So I get to use the tools that we work with and implement. I'm very fortunate to lead a team of experienced nurse informaticists and physician informaticists who focus on the implementation science, the components of getting those tools, the high tech, into the hands of the clinicians for the patients and for their colleagues. It's a privilege, really, to be able to serve my colleagues in that way, and certainly to be able to see patients and apply these tools in real time. So we've had the opportunity to do that at Moffitt with lots of new technologies, and very grateful for the chance to speak to how we do that.
That's awesome. So what's your take on this whole explosion of Gen AI over the last year? It feels like the world has completely changed since January or February of last year. But what's your take, Ben?
If you look at the Google Trends, yes, you will see a sudden spike in the terminology, right? Everybody's buzzword bingo suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. But if you've been in the business long enough, I don't know that it was all that much of a surprise. I think we saw it happening. This is just that level of maturity of the technology. We knew this was going to happen. Of course, once something hits the market and there's enough buzz around it, that becomes the hot new thing, right? So we might have had different terms for similar technologies in the past. So when we were looking at pilots for things like virtual or digital scribe, we may have just called it a electronic scribe or something like that. So we didn't necessarily call it generative AI, but now it helps, I think, to have the buzz around this because people have a better understanding, or at least they think they have a better understanding of the terminology. So now we have this common language we can use when we're talking with colleagues and vendors.
And any downsides to the hype and the buzz?
Of course, there's always downsides. I mean, you hear about hype and buzz when it comes to a new medication hitting the market or new technology, you name it. So you have to worry about expectation management. Certainly, when people hear about the buzz, they might actually believe a lot of the hype around it, that this can do all the great things that are being promised. It might be able to, but those things might be in the future, maybe not right now. So it's really helping people to see that there is promise in this technology, and even if they don't have it immediately in their hands, that there's an opportunity here to work with the technology and to learn about it, not be intimidated by it, and really approach it with eyes open, but with honesty and a little skepticism along the way.
Yeah. Okay. What has been sort of your specific reaction for the organization for Moffitt? Like what's going on about Gen AI within Moffitt, if anything?
Oh, well, we've had the advantage of being a little bit ahead of the curve at Moffitt. They've invested in new technologies even before the buzzwords really hit, and within the past year, if you will. So we've had resources put towards, like I mentioned, the virtual scribe effort or digital scribe, and we've been able to preemptively look at those pilots and the capabilities and really test the waters there. And our faculty are very engaged, and our patients are also contributing and engaged on our committees and panels and looking at these new technologies and saying, how does that really help the business of oncology, the prevention and cure of cancer? So we have that perspective. While our problems may not be unique, our perspective certainly is. And we're trying to apply that unique perspective to new technologies, even as they are coming out and really on the bleeding edge, but really in a safe way to make sure that it's appropriate for our patients and our providers.
Anything that you've heard And that's really helpful, right? Because I think it seems like you have a really good group engaged internally.
Mhm.
How is this being fed? So are you seeing good use cases on the outside? Are you seeing health systems do interesting things in Gen AI? Have you seen use cases that rise to the top for your attention? Or are these more like we've always had these problems, now let's look at whether Gen AI would be suitable for these?
Mm.
How are you approaching it?
Problems looking for solutions or solutions looking for problems, basically.
Mhm.
So a little bit of both, always. We certainly, as a cancer center, we have peer cancer centers we get to talk to and we are collaborative with and we all compare notes and say, what's working for you, what's working for them, et cetera. As a member of the Comprehensive Cancer Center Network, the NCCN, Moffitt is able to compare notes with other academic cancer centers and say, what's really working and what's out there. No matter what EMR you might be on, a lot of the hurdles are very similar. Burnout, documentation issues, turnaround times, transparency, integration, you name it. And so as new tools become available, generative AI being one of them, we're saying, all right, we have this new tool. How do we apply it to the known problems? And of course, we are comparing use cases from other organizations and comparing notes. But we try to get creative about applying this new tool and saying, how does this work for the problems we've already identified? And then does it highlight new issues that we need to investigate further?
Yeah. Okay. Any use cases you've seen that are your favorites?
Personally, I will keep going back to the scribe issue as someone who has to write notes. I will tell you it saved me a significant amount of time, even in the pilot stages. So I look forward to applying that in the future. I think that'll be standard of care in the next few years, having a digital scribe assisting in note creation and completion. We're also going to see that in communications where draft templates are developed, and also suggestions on how to navigate the record. Something you might want to refer to as a data concierge or a data butler, where it's
Mhm.
really looking through a vast amount of data. At Moffitt, we see patients who are often already diagnosed with cancer, and they have tons of records that we are ingesting. Getting through those records can take a lot of time, and our providers spend many hours going through those records and finding the right details. That could be facilitated or at least augmented and supported by technology that can kind of sift through that data to find the relevant data points and bring those to the surface for easier review. I really am excited about that because I think it's something that could highlight some of those issues within the old records that are often very hard to dig through, and even, sometimes are just scanned images of PDFs, things like that. So as that technology advances, I believe we're going to see significant improvements in data integration and utilization.
And by contrast, any use cases that you're like, do not use Gen AI for that. Whoever thought of that?
I think the conversation bots are still working on things. I don't know about you, but I try to use some of I won't name names, but some of the voice assistance tools that many of us have in our homes. And I've had
Mhm.
my frustrating moments with mine. I think we all have some humorous examples of when we've asked it to play a certain song and it plays something completely different.
Mhm.
Those kind of things. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for growth in that space, and maybe it's not quite ready for clinical prime time for maybe advanced uses. If a patient's asking about specific outcomes of clinical diagnoses, that is still probably best handled by clinicians. You
Mhm.
really need clinicians to be engaged, and these are just tools. These are not replacing the clinicians. These are augmenting and supporting clinical workflows.
Got it. Okay. You seem to have had a lot of success within Moffitt in, again, as I said in my intro, figuring out how to break up a complex implementation and then figure out a roadmap to get it successfully through in the organization. What's your sense of how you would do it with Gen AI solutions? So let's take Scribe, for example, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is a roadmap if another organization is looking at that? How would you set it up so that it's successful in implementation?
I'm an informatician. It's always starting with the workflow, right? The
Yeah.
workflow guides everything. So you really have to look at how is the work done, not how is it supposed to be done, not how people think it's supposed to be done or how they think it's being done, but really observe it. Go to the people who are doing the work, who are going to be impacted most directly by the technology. And that includes patients. And talk to them and say, all right, how could this work? Let's really explore this, and then work backwards from that workflow. What's key at Moffitt especially, but anywhere, is stakeholder engagement and making sure that you've got those people involved whose workflows will be impacted, but bringing them in at the beginning and not after the decisions are made, making sure they're in part of the governance, a key part, and they're signing off on these decisions. For us, that's been, I have to admit, probably one of the easiest parts because we have such an involved clinical group at Moffitt. I love working with these colleagues. They're always engaged and they're always excited about trying something new if it benefits the patients and their colleagues. But if you're not doing that and you're implementing after the fact, you're going to be facing an uphill climb. People won't know how good the workflows could be, what improvements are coming, and there may be an intimidation factor of people not understanding the potential impact. Because if you don't explain these things, if you don't pull people in at the beginning, they will make their own assumptions, and that's just human. So pulling them in early, involving them in the decision making, critical. But once you do that, the excitement starts to build on its own. And so I really feel like that's been critical and really led to the success of our implementation so far.
And from a governance standpoint, and maybe even from like a buying decision standpoint, if I'm a vendor in the Gen AI space today, right, who am I selling to? Am I selling to you? Am I selling to a CIO? Am I selling to a CEO? Like, how should I navigate that?
The vendors today, I am cautious to say that there's any one individual that you're selling to. I know every organization is different. So there are different business practices at every organization where you may have a single pivot point for purchasing at one organization, where at another one, you have many stakeholders who have access to pull vendors into an organization. Again, I'm going to keep going back to this, workflow is king. So if you can demonstrate improvements in the workflow, you will get buy-in from a diverse range of clinical stakeholders. And I still believe that those are the bread and butter of most healthcare institutions. So if you get the buy-in of your clinical stakeholders, usually the rest of the organization, from my experience, has been able to follow. The clinical buy-in is critical because that's where the choke points are, right? The bottlenecks. And a lot of the business of healthcare hinges on working with your clinicians to identify those. So if they don't see the benefit, it's not going to succeed.
Got it. And when you say clinician buyer, who is a clinician buyer?
So not necessarily clinician buy-in, but buy-in from, I apologize, I should have enunciated better, but buy-in from those clinicians. And those would be key clinical stakeholders, not just those who are the early adopters of new technology. And we all know who some of those people are. They've got all the cool gear, all the tech, everything else. It's really those who have standing at the organization, who are highly respected, who may be resistant to change even. And once you get that level of buy-in from somebody who says, you know what, I've been here X amount of years, they're highly respected in their department and they see the benefit. That's when you really know that you've got potential at that organization to really gain traction. And it can take time and it can take a lot of effort and back and forth to really address their concerns, but it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Has your organization figured out from the perspective of like how you evaluate and how you kind of govern these solutions, are you treating Gen AI the same way you would treat digital solutions, or are you evaluating them, governing them differently?
So I know that every organization is reassessing their AI governance, right? We've all got to figure out how to navigate that field, especially if the AI tools are more of a black box and you don't have everything fully explained on how it works. Because the organization has to be very thoughtful, has to think about what's going into it, has to address concerns of bias, and that has to be looked at comprehensively. I don't believe we have previously really analyzed other efforts to the same level of scrutiny because there wasn't as much concern of hidden bias in something where the algorithm was transparent or the workflow was transparent. We have to step things up and ask for that higher level of scrutiny. And it helps to have a team that knows the technology. So Moffitt now has a department of machine learning, which has a specialized skill set in these things. So we've been able to fold them into the governance process to say, all right, is this legitimate? Can you review this and evaluate it?
Mm-hmm.
Without that expertise, you're applying old rules to new technology, and you're likely to miss some things, just like we were talking about with the bias and other concerns.
Mm-hmm. And I know that some, your team is now sort of thinking about that, right? Thinking about like, what is the governance around Gen AI look like? What does our policies look like and all that? So, I think that's really interesting. What is your recommendation to other organizations or other health systems that are just starting on this journey that haven't yet done an implementation in Gen AI? What would you have done differently if you were starting from scratch? Maybe?
I don't know about differently, but certainly It is very useful to take your key stakeholders and make sure they have a strong understanding of
Hmm.
generative AI and especially the risks involved. So finding an organization you trust and seeking out educational resources from that organization. There are groups out there. Certainly my bias is towards informatics organizations like AMI and others that have resources where you can have some of your key stakeholders do deep dives and become subject matter experts within your organization. I would also advise not duplicating governance. I don't know about maybe other organizations per se, but I know sometimes, especially in academic organizations, we are keen to say, let's create another council, let's create another committee, but you run the risk of having duplication and parallel work and splitting your resources. I'm biased towards figuring out how to develop and strengthen your existing governance models and saying, how do we fold this in? How do we make it a key component and really make our existing governance even stronger?
That's great. All right, so some final thoughts, and I'm looking at some of the questions that we've received from some of our members before. So, should organizations start looking at roles that are dedicated to AI and Gen AI outside of your traditional systems? So we've seen some organizations hire chief AI, Gen AI officers or chief AI officers, whatever. What's your perspective on that? Is that a thing? Should we do it? Or if so, why? If not, why not?
It's a thing. It's a thing. Certainly, it would be wrong to say that it's not a thing. We see it. Many organizations are creating these roles. Doing so with intent and recognizing what you want from these roles before you create it is critical. Making sure the expectations are clear from the get-go and making sure you invest in that role, that it's not just a figurehead, on the sidelines, making sure they're integrated into the organization's existing structure, governance processes, and that they have a team that can work with them, or they are supporting a team that is already robust. Whether or not you create a new role or you support existing roles in the organization to develop this knowledge is really based on organizational resources, right? So if you have the capacity at the organization to create new positions, that's great. And you can maybe recruit or develop an individual within the organization for that role. But if you don't, then you have to find ways and get creative to really train up the existing teams. And that's where we go back to the education and developing your internal talent and making sure that that really reinforces your retention too, is when you've developed that internal talent and strengthened those positions.
And where would you think that this person would kind of what level of influence does this person need to be able to do it well?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about someone who is a subject matter expert in a brand new field, they're going to have the ears of those making the decisions, right? So they need to be critical part of the governance process. We just talked about that, how they need to be folded into that and really understand where they fit in with that program. They need to be a trusted advisor of the leaders who are making those decisions and evaluating those products. So they need to be brought in at least as an advisor level, if nothing else. And certainly really a resource that the entire organization can reach out to. So it's pretty broad spectrum. I am biased as a CMIO. We get used to being in the pivot for lots of different teams, but that's frequently where a role like this needs to be.
Okay, and then the last question on this, sort of just from that perspective. So let's say an organization has a chief AI officer, they're reporting at the right levels, maybe have a team that kind of does all the work. What's your maybe 3 or 4 things you would think would be their key KPIs? How would you hold them accountable? What does success look like for a role like that?
Key KPIs. Wow. Okay. So it's not necessarily, when you've got brand new technologies like this, it's not necessarily those things which are going to be 100% out of the park, perfect hits, right? You're going to try some things, you're going to have to test the waters, but it's going to be at what rate is this individual contributing to new evaluations? At what rate are they informing new decisions? At what rate are they facilitating, the education and growth of the organization? So there may be ways in which this individual is providing new knowledge to the organization and augmenting the existing structure that isn't necessarily always buying a new product. If you're just buying new products and building the KPIs on new products, you wind up with a lot of new products and not necessarily new functions.
Yeah. And I think organizations that have a certain level of maturity in their data structures and data strategies today probably would benefit from a role like that. And so I'm also imagining that there's probably, like a self-evaluation of like, are we ready for it? Like, do we even have our data in a box that can actually be utilized, I guess?
I mean, imagine the situation of someone recruited into that role. Their expectations would be, I'm going to be asked to do X, and if I don't have access to those data points, how do I move things forward? So if they know the lay of the land, if the organization is transparent with whom they're recruiting, they may see it as an opportunity and a challenge to build a program that they're excited about.
Mhm.
Certainly, that's its own opportunity, and some individuals will be drawn to that.
Mhm. And do you think that this is a maturity of a informatics function, or do you think it's a maturity from a transformation function? Do you think that AI at the end of this, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years in healthcare systems, is that just going to be like a matured informatics group? Is that going to be a transformation function where everything becomes AI? Is that a digital innovation function? Is that, something that a CIO should be doing because it's part of the EMR? Where do you think, what's that? Who's leveling up to get there, I
All
guess?
of the above. Am I allowed to choose that as an answer? Certainly. Is that option E or something? Um, there's such diversity in organizational structures. There's no one size that fits all, right? That's why you see different org charts. That's why you see restructuring, and certainly it depends on different skill sets, different organizational needs, you name it. I do believe that AI will become folded in to the tool sets, and there will be different ranges of it. When you say AI, it's much like years ago when we said CPOE. What a broad term. So we have to stretch it out and really get into the nuances of what do we mean. So generative AI is helping to parse out some of that by getting more specific. It will be folded into standard practice. As I mentioned with the digital scribe, I believe that'll just be standard practice within the next few years. That will be folded into the EMRs.
Hmm.
Other levels of that and other features to be determined, but I don't think we're going to talk about AI the same way we did a year ago.
Okay, awesome. What did I not ask you? What am I missing?
I'm not sure. I mean, there's what needs are out there within the AI industry. Certainly, appropriate regulatory guidance. We're seeing that maturing with the FDA and software as a medical device requirements. So I think that will continue to grow as we see more expertise in federal regulations and as organizations understand what the boundaries are and the limits to that development.
Mhm.
The bias components need to be explored further and given structure, so that these new models being developed really have more of a framework and a proving ground, if you will, for how effective and safe they are for patients. So those, to me, those are big aspects. And then how does it fold into bread and butter clinical decision support? I've got a bias. I am fortunate to be on the steering committee with a HRQ funded project through NORC, looking at clinical decision support and how is that integrated and how is it patient centric. So how are we going to apply AI to that very complex field? That's growing, and we need to apply every tool in the toolbox to benefit patients.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think, as our Valid AI initiative is taking steam, and I think, we have 44 health systems there, Moffitt being one of them. One of the things that we're really thinking about in the next quarter is what can we do as a consortium to help health systems with adoption? And it
Yeah.
sounds like you've kind of laid out our roadmap for us, which is, focusing on these key implementation factors, bias, et cetera. I think probably is the need of the hour.
Looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Thank
taking the
you.
time. Really appreciate your perspectives. And again, as I said, I'm sure everyone listening to this feels the same way as I do. You're very deeply knowledgeable about this. And again, as I said, probably the best CMO I've seen. Um, Thank you for sharing your perspectives, and we wish you luck with everything you're doing at Moffitt.